The silence that broke him it was just after midnight in the Hollywood Hills. The stars were cloaked behind a curtain of soft fog, and the usually vibrant hum of Los Angeles nightlife seemed distant, as though the city, too, held its breath for what was about to unfold. Inside a house built not for show, but for soul, Keanu Reeves sat alone in the den, legs crossed loosely beneath him on the wide couch, the dim glow of the fireplace flickering across the creases of a face that carried more stories than most libraries. His black shirt clung gently to his frame, and his eyes deep, unwavering, and kind, stared at a single envelope placed on the glass table in front of him. The paper looked harmless, ordinary even, but it was heavier than stone in his mind, because it wasn't just ink on a page. It was silence turned into words. It was goodbye written in the hand of the woman he had loved with a part of his heart. He never knew still worked for the world. Keanu Reeves was unshakable, stoic, humble. A man who had survived unimaginable loss and still gave quietly, loved deeply, and spoke rarely. But for Alexandra, he had made an exception. When she walked into his life, it wasn't with fireworks or the breathlessness of cinematic romance. It was with slow, consistent presence. She had laughed with him when no one else could make him smile. She had sat with him through mornings where memories of his late daughter and fiancé stole his appetite. She had understood his silence until one day, it seemed, she didn't. He hadn't expected the letter. He hadn't expected her absence. He hadn't expected that the woman who promised to grow old beside him would one day leave without a word, except for the one he now held in trembling hands. As his fingers finally broke the seal, his breath caught, not because of what he might read, but because deep down, he already knew what it would say. The signs had been there, the rushed dinners, the missed calls, the flicker in her eyes when she said, "I'm just tired," but he had ignored it all, not out of naivety, but out of hope, the kind of hope that only someone who has lost everything clings to like oxygen. Hope that maybe, this time, love would stay. The letter was short. No long explanations. No cruel words. Just a confession. She had fallen in love with someone else. Someone who felt like a mirror. Someone who made her feel seen again. Keanu's eyes stayed fixed on the last sentence for minutes. "You are the best man I have ever known, but I don't think I was ever enough for your sadness." And in that moment, the world didn't end with a bang, but with a breathless hush. The kind that comes after you've been punched in the gut and can't remember how to inhale. The fire crackled beside him, casting shadows against the walls, and the room, once filled with her laughter, her books, her half-drunk mugs of herbal tea, now felt like a hollow museum of memories. His thumb traced the curve of her handwriting, and somewhere inside him, something fragile, not just his heart, but maybe his trust in fate, fractured. But Keanu Reeves didn't rage. He didn't scream. He didn't drown himself in whiskey or throw the letter into the fire. Instead, he sat still, because that's what he had learned to do through every loss, to sit with the pain, to hold it gently, and to let it burn without becoming it. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "It's okay, it's okay," as though trying to soothe the little boy inside him who had been abandoned too many times before. And then, slowly, he stood. He walked to the bookshelf, the one she had helped him fill with rare poetry, art history, and dusty science fiction novels, and pulled out a worn journal. He hadn't written in it for years, not since the morning he last visited his daughter's grave. But tonight, the silence needed a witness. With slow, steady strokes. He wrote not about betrayal or heartbreak. He wrote about gratitude, about the mornings he woke up to her sketching with wild charcoal fingers, about the way her head fit on his chest when she was tired, about the first time she made him laugh so hard he cried. And then, he wrote what he didn't say when she was still here. "If I was too heavy for you to carry, I forgive you for setting me down." That was Keanu, always finding grace in the very places people leave wreckage. But the story didn't end there, because as he looked out the window into the fog-covered night, something deeper stirred inside him. Not bitterness, but a kind of quiet power, a voice that said, "Maybe now. It's time for me to find the pieces of myself I've always given away." And with that, the man who had spent years tending to the hearts of others, who had played saviors and lures on screen while quietly breaking inside in real life, stood tall, not in pride, but in purpose. What he didn't know yet was that this heartbreak would lead him into something more profound than revenge or recovery. It would awaken something sacred, the decision to stop surviving, and finally start living. Asterisk asterisk the gift she never knew she gave. 12 weeks had passed since the letter. 2 weeks since silence had replaced Alexandra's voice in the corners of the house, and Keanu had begun the strange process of returning to himself. But it wasn't healing. Not yet. It was more like walking barefoot across shards of the past. Each memory cut just a little deeper, and every step reminded him that moving forward didn't mean it stopped hurting. Yet he continued, not because he wanted to feel better, but because doing nothing felt like drowning. The house had changed. The once shared studio, filled with Alexandra's art supplies and sketches of their shared mornings, was now empty. The canvas she had been working on left unfinished, a portrait of a faceless figure that oddly resembled him, paused forever in vulnerability. The mornings were the worst. There was a specific kind of loneliness that came with waking up to an empty space that used to hold another soul. He'd reach over out of habit, only to touch cold sheets and the echo of what once was. And yet, instead of allowing that space to remain a graveyard, Keanu made a quiet decision. He began writing letters, not to send, not even to keep, just to write. Every morning, a single letter to Alexandra, not out of bitterness, but out of honesty. He poured out the things he wished he had said, the fears he had never voiced, and the parts of himself he had hidden even from her. And as he wrote, a truth began to rise from the ink. Alexandra had never truly betrayed him. Not in malice, at least. She had simply been unprepared for the depth of his silence. The weight of a man who had spent years building a fortress of calm to protect the heart that had been shattered too many times. One morning, after finishing a letter titled "The Light You Didn't Know You Were," Keanu looked out at the garden she had once planted. The rosemary was overgrown, the lavender wilting. It looked like how he felt, a little unkempt, a little forgotten. But it was alive, and that mattered. He stepped outside, barefoot on the stone path, the sunlight gentle on his skin. And for the first time in days, he didn't feel like an actor playing it normal. He felt human. Later that evening, as the golden light filtered through the windows, he sat with his old friend, Daniel, one of the few people who had known him before the fame, before the heartbreaks. Daniel didn't ask questions. He simply poured them each a cup of tea and sat quietly beside him on the porch. But as the sky turned purple, he finally said, "You still love her?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He stared at the horizon, the wind tugging gently at his hair, and then whispered, "I don't think love disappears. I think it just changes clothes." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding what most wouldn't, that Keanu's love had never been about possession. It had always been about presence, about the act of choosing someone over and over again, even when they were no longer there. That night, alone again, Keanu opened the journal and began writing something different. Not a letter, but a list of all the things he had forgotten about himself. His love for motorcycles, his curiosity about ancient philosophy, his fascination with the stars, his need for silence not as an escape, but as sacred space. The list grew, and with each item, it felt like a rope being thrown down into the well he'd been trapped in. He could climb out, not all at once, but slowly. Days turned into weeks, and the ache became quieter, like background noise rather than a scream. And then, one afternoon, in a quiet bookstore tucked away from the city, he saw a child sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading a book about constellations. She looked up at him with wide eyes, not out of recognition, but with a smile that said, "I think you love the stars too," and something about that moment, so simple and unremarkable, cracked something open in him. He smiled back, knelt beside her, and whispered, "Do you know the stars are older than pain?" She grinned and nodded. "They shine anyway," she said. Keanu left the store with a copy of that same book, not because he needed it, but because it reminded him that even in endings, there were beginnings. Alexandra's absence had not destroyed him. It had revealed him. It had stripped away the parts of him that clung to tightly. And what remained was not brokenness, but raw, aching truth. A man still capable of love, still capable of being surprised by beauty. And just as he was leaving the store, he noticed something unexpected. One of Alexandra's paintings hung in the back corner, part of a local artist's gallery wall. It was titled "The Man Who Carried Silence Like a Song," and there, among the brushstrokes, he saw himself, not as a figure of sadness, but a stillness, of strength. And in that moment, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe. Maybe she had loved him, more than she could say. Maybe walking away was her way of not breaking him further. Maybe this was her final gift, not the betrayal, but the freedom to finally see himself, and for the first time since the night he opened that letter. Keanu didn't cry. He closed his eyes, placed a hand over his heart, and whispered the name he thought he'd buried, Alexandra. Not with anger, not with longing, but with peace. He walked out of the store into the golden sunlight, not as a man recovering from heartbreak, but as a man finally remembering who he had always been, even before love, even after loss. Asterisk, the woman on the train. It was early autumn in Kyoto when Keanu Reeves boarded a quiet train, bound for Arashiyama. The air was crisp, painted with the scent of cedar and temple incense, and the maple leaves had just begun to blush red. After months of silent unraveling and slow self-restoration, Keanu had finally left Los Angeles behind, not in escape, but in search. There was something sacred about Kyoto, something in the way the silence hung with memory, the way even the trees seemed to bow in humility. He had visited before, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't here for a film or a press event. He was here to remember how to be alone without feeling lonely. The train moved gently through the countryside, its windows framing moments of everyday life, a grandmother sweeping a stone porch, children laughing as they raced bicycles down narrow alleys, a monk adjusting his robes outside a temple gate. Keanu sat quietly, dressed in a charcoal coat and soft scarf, a notebook resting on his lap. He didn't write. He just watched, listened, breathed, and then, as the train pulled into the second station, she stepped aboard. She was a stranger, yet there was something disarmingly familiar in her presence. Not her face, not her clothes, but her energy, like someone who had once broken apart and rebuilt herself without asking anyone for help. She wore no makeup, carried a small leather-bound book, and had a strand of gray in her hair that she didn't try to hide. She moved with grace, but not perfection, the kind of grace that came from surviving, not posing. There was an empty seat across from him. She took it without a word. At first, they didn't speak. He kept his gaze on the window, but his mind kept circling back to her. There was something unsettling about the way she stared out the window, not vacant, but deeply alive, as if her thoughts were holding hands with everything outside. After a few minutes, she glanced over and caught his eyes. She smiled. It wasn't flirtatious or curious. It was knowing. It was the smile of someone who could see the weight someone else was carrying, without needing it explained. "I like this route," she said softly. "It doesn't rush." Keanu nodded, unsure why that sentence struck him so deeply. "Neither do I anymore," he replied, almost involuntarily. It was the first time he had spoken to a stranger since the letter. And just like that, a conversation began, not a light one, but a deeply human one. They spoke of quiet things, of loss, of how grief ages you in places no one can see, of how people leave not always out of cruelty, but because they're afraid they're not enough. She never asked his name. He never asked hers. They didn't need to. In that moment, they weren't actors or strangers. They were the people on a train, finding sanctuary in honesty. She told him about her brother who died in a car crash. He told her about a painting in a bookstore that reminded him he was still worthy of being seen. They spoke like old friends meeting again after many lifetimes. No pretense, no performance, just presence. When her stop came, she stood up and hesitated. "You're still healing," she said, as if finishing a sentence he hadn't begun. "But don't forget, healing doesn't mean you stop feeling. It just means you stop fearing the feeling." She reached into her coat and handed him a folded paper. "This helped me once. Maybe it will help you too." And then she was gone. Keanu unfolded the paper. It was a poem, handwritten in soft blue ink. It read, "You are not the ache they left behind. You are the sky that stayed blue anyway. You are the hands that kept building peace from broken pieces." He closed his eyes, breathed, felt something loosen inside him. That night, as he walked the quiet path near the bamboo forest, the moonlight bathing the ground in silver, Keanu finally allowed the tears to fall. Not the kind born from devastation, but the kind that come when something painful finally lets go. It wasn't about Alexandra anymore. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about love, the kind that evolves, that teaches, that breaks you open so something stronger can rise. He whispered into the dark, "Thank you for leaving," not with bitterness, but with reverence. Because now, he understood, her leaving didn't mean he was unlovable. It meant she wasn't ready to love someone who loved so deeply. And that wasn't his fault. It never was. The next morning, he wrote his first letter not to her, but to himself. Asterisk, the letter to himself pen felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't the weight of the metal or the ink inside, it was the gravity of what it meant. Keanu sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of a traditional ryokan in Kyoto. The quiet rustle of bamboo swaying outside the paper-screened doors. Morning light spilled through like a soft confession, and the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was sacred. He held the pen above the page for a moment, then brought it down, as if with every stroke, he was reclaiming pieces of himself that had been lost not just to Alexandra, but to decades of giving more than he ever received. He began simply, "Dear me." The words startled him, not because they were unfamiliar, but because he realized he had never written to himself before. He had written scripts, poems, tributes, apologies, gratitude, but never acknowledgement. Never the kind of letter that held space for the boy who had been abandoned too young. The man who had watched too many loved ones disappear too soon. The actor who gave his soul to characters because it was safer than offering it in real life. His hand moved slowly at first, uncertain. But then the words came like a river bursting through a dam. You were never too quiet. You were never too strange. You were never too broken to be loved. You only loved deeper than most people knew how to hold. That's not a weakness, it's a gift. You never needed to be louder. You never needed to be saved. You only needed to be seen. And I see you now. With every sentence, something inside him realigned. He wasn't writing as a man seeking validation. He was writing as a man finally offering himself the compassion he had so freely given others. The pen didn't just move with truth, it moved with tenderness. He wrote about Alexandra, yes, but not with blame. He thanked her for being a mirror, for staying just long enough to show him what he had buried, and for leaving, because her absence created the space for this very moment of conversation with the only person who had walked with him through every loss, every moment of silence, every breath between grief and grace. Himself. As he finished the final line, "I will never abandon you again," a tear fell on the paper. Not sorrow, not grief, release, the kind of tear that tastes like truth. Later that day, Keanu wandered through the ancient streets of Kyoto alone, but it didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt like solitude. There was a difference. One aches for company, the other honors your own. He visited an old temple tucked beneath a canopy of ginkgo trees. A monk, perhaps in his 70s, sat quietly by the entrance, sipping tea, his face weathered by years and yet shining with childlike peace. Keanu bowed slightly in greeting, and the monk responded not with words, but with a gesture. He patted the empty seat beside him. They sat together in complete silence for 20 minutes. No words, no introductions, just the human beings breathing the same sacred air. When Keanu finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "How do you forgive yourself for trusting people who leave?" The monk turned to him with soft, amused eyes and said, "You don't forgive yourself for trusting. You thank yourself for not turning cold." Then he added, "Pain doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you made it with your heart. That is the right way to live." Keanu looked away, blinking back the stink behind his eyes. He hadn't realized how badly he needed someone to say that out loud that evening. Back at the ryokan, he lit a candle and reread his letter to himself, and for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't feel the weight of being left behind. He felt the quiet power of being present for himself. He wrote another letter, not for Alexandra, not even for the woman on the train. This time, it was to the future version of himself, the one who might one day fall in love again. He wrote, "Love again. Don't be afraid. If it hurts, let it. If it ends, let it. If it begins, welcome it. But never forget who stayed when everyone else left. You did." The night air was cool as he stepped out onto the porch, the sound of a nearby stream trickling like time itself. He closed his eyes, hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold. He whispered into the dark, not expecting a reply, "Wherever you are, Alexandra, I hope you found what you were looking for." And for the first time, he meant it. The pain wasn't gone, but it wasn't ruling him anymore. It had become a teacher, a map, a doorway, and just as he turned to go inside, something beautiful happened. The wind shifted gently through the trees, carrying with it the scent of lavender, the same scent Alexandra used to wear. It wasn't a haunting. It was a reminder that love, even when lost, leaves behind echoes of grace. And Keanu smiled, not because he had moved on, but because he had moved within. Asterisk asterisk, when the past not to gain there are moments when time does not move forward, but instead folds back on itself, moments when the past returns not with anger or unfinished longing, but with a quiet ache that asks only to be acknowledged. Keanu Reeves had been back in Los Angeles for 3 weeks. The trip to Kyoto had changed something inside him, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in subtle, foundational shifts. He walked differently now, more grounded, as if each step was chosen rather than drifted into. He spoke less but listened more, even to his own silence. And most importantly, he had stopped asking why Alexandra left and started asking why he had spent so long forgetting himself in the process of loving others. One rainy evening, he found himself alone in a quiet jazz bar tucked beneath an old bookstore in Silver Lake. It was one of those places where the world slowed down, where the saxophone curled like smoke into the air, and everyone spoke in hushed tones as if protecting the sacredness of sorrow. He ordered a tea, not a whiskey, not wine. He was done numbing. He wanted to feel everything now, even the things that hurt, especially those. Pain, he had learned, was the proof of a living heart. As the trio played a haunting version of Blue and Green, Keanu stared into his cup, lost in thought, when he heard a voice behind him, a voice he hadn't heard in months, but which his body recognized instantly. "Do you mind if I sit here?" He looked up. It was her. Alexandra. Not in a dream, not in a memory, in the flesh. Her hair a bit longer, pulled back loosely, her face thinner, more tired perhaps, but still wearing the same expression he remembered so well, the one that carried both kindness and quiet conflict. She held a book in one hand, a coat draped over her arm. She looked unsure, even nervous, which was something he had never seen on her before. Keanu nodded slowly, motioning to the empty seat across from him. She sat down without a word. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The music filled the space like a third presence, softening the sharpness of what could have been. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't know you'd be here. I've been coming to this place for years." He nodded. "So have I. We must have missed each other." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked away, then back at him. "You look lighter." Keanu gave a soft laugh. "I'm not, but I am more honest with my heaviness now." Her eyes glistened, and he noticed her fingers fidgeting with the corner of her book. She said nothing for a long time, and then she reached into her coat and placed something on the table. It was the letter, the one she had written before she disappeared, but now there were pages attached to it, pages he had never seen. "I rewrote it," she said. "I didn't want that to be the last thing you remembered. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I didn't know how to stand next to your pain without disappearing into it. I thought I needed someone else. But what I really needed was to find the parts of myself I kept hiding from you. That wasn't your fault. It wasn't your burden to carry." Keanu didn't reach for the pages. Not yet. He just listened. The old him would have tried to fix it, soften it, even take responsibility for her confusion. But the man sitting across from her now was no longer afraid of letting people feel the consequences of their own leaving. "You broke something," he said gently. "Not just between us but in me. And for a long time, I thought it meant I wasn't enough. But I see it differently now." She lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry. I know," he replied, not out of cruelty but clarity. "And I believe you." The jazz quieted. The bar dimmed further as the rain outside tapped gently against the windows, like time knocking on the soul. "I didn't come to ask for anything," she said. "I just wanted you to know I finally understood what I left behind." Keanu finally picked up the letter. He didn't read it. Not yet. He slid it into his coat pocket. "Some things are meant to be understood later," he said. "Not so they can be repaired, but so they can be released." She nodded slowly. "You were never too much, and you were never too little," he said. They sat together for a moment longer, and then, as gently as she had come, she stood. "I hope you find a love that holds you without fear," she whispered. Keanu looked at her one last time. "I already have," he said, placing a hand over his chest, over the place where his new letter to himself now lived. "It's not from someone else, but it's real." She smiled through her tears, and then she left. This time, without a letter. This time, without taking anything with her. This time, leaving something behind instead. Closure. That night, Keanu didn't cry. He didn't ache. He simply walked home through the rain, each drop a reminder that even storms cleanse what they do not destroy. He entered his home, lit a candle, and finally opened the rewritten letter, but halfway through, he folded it back and placed it in a drawer, not because he didn't care, but because he finally didn't need answers to feel whole. He stood at the window, watching the city glow below, and whispered, not to her, but to himself, I'm still here, and I'm enough, asterisk asterisk. The man who stayed it had been nearly a year since the night Alexandra left. 12 full moons had risen and fallen since her voice had last filled the kitchen with quiet humming, since her laughter had danced across the living room floor as she sipped red wine barefoot. Yet time had not simply erased her presence, it had reshaped it, folded it gently into the background of Keanu Reeves's life like the memory of a long-closed book, still resting on a shelf. But this story, as he had come to understand, was never truly about her. It was always about the man who remained when the noise faded. The man who chose to stay with himself. Keanu now lived differently. Not louder, not flashier, but more awake. His mornings began with long walks in the hills above his home, where the light poured over the city like forgiveness. He had returned to photography not for galleries or anyone's approval, but because it allowed him to frame stillness, to slow down the world and hold a moment just long enough to hear it breathe. He captured shadows falling through glass, old couples holding hands in cafes, children dancing in fountains, birds caught mid-flight. Each photo was a small act of reverence, a reminder that beauty didn't need permission to exist. The letters to himself had never stopped. They were now stacked neatly in a wooden box he kept by his bedside. On days when the silence felt too heavy, he would read one at random, and no matter how old the words were, they always met him exactly where he was. There was a softness in that practice, a returning to self that no relationship had ever quite offered. One evening, just after sunset, Keanu hosted a small dinner in his home. Not a Hollywood gathering, not a press event, just a quiet evening with people who saw him without the armor. His old friend Daniel was there, as were a few artists and writers he had met through his journey. They laughed, shared stories, passed around bowls of soup and warm bread. It was simple, honest. He had once feared that this kind of peace was reserved for people who had never been shattered. Now he knew it was created by those who had been broken and still chose to build. After the guests left, he stayed by the fireplace, sipping tea, watching the flames curl upward like memories returning to the sky. That's when he heard the quiet knock. He opened the door, surprised to see a young woman standing there no older than 23, eyes filled with uncertainty, holding a package in her hands. I'm sorry to show up like this, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know who else to give this to. Keanu tilted his head gently. Do I know you? She nodded slowly. No, but I knew her. Alexandra. I was her intern, before everything. We stayed in touch even after she moved. She talked about you more than you'll ever know. His breath caught slightly, but he said nothing. He simply waited. She passed away last week, the girl whispered. Cancer. She kept it quiet. Didn't want anyone to carry it with her. Keanu felt the world pause, but not collapse. There was no storm inside him, only silence. The kind that wraps around grief without rushing it. She left this for you. Said you would understand what it meant. The girl handed him the package. It was wrapped in simple brown paper, tied with a black string. Her name was written in ink on the top. Alexandra. Thank you, Keanu said, placing a hand over his heart. The girl nodded and turned away, disappearing into the night like a passing season. He didn't open the package right away. He sat with it, breathed beside it. Then, after a long moment, he untied the string. Inside was a single painting. It was a portrait of him, but it wasn't like the others she had painted. This one was different. It showed him not as a movie star, not as the stoic man the world admired, but as something more vulnerable, more sacred. It was him, sitting cross-legged with a journal in his lap, surrounded by open windows and falling light. But what struck him most was not the figure, but the way she had painted his eyes. Not sad, not haunted, but wide open, reflecting the sky, as though the universe itself had taken refuge in him. At the bottom of the canvas were four words, etched in small gold letters. You stayed. I saw. Keanu's throat tightened, not with regret, but with release. She had seen him after all. Not just the grief, not just the silence. She had seen the man beneath it all, the one who never left himself, even when she did. He placed the painting beside his bed, not as a shrine, but as a reminder that love, no matter how it ends, always leaves something behind. A lesson, a truth, a mirror. That night, Keanu lay in bed with the window open, the wind breathing through the curtains like a lullaby. He looked at the stars and smiled. "I'm not angry," he whispered. "I'm grateful." And he meant it, because heartbreak had not broken him, it had brought him home. To the man who stayed, to the man who learned that the greatest love story of his life would always begin and end with how he chose to love himself.